These stories still excite the imagination, making one wonder how deeply war and mysticism are intertwined. The Second World War left not only wounds in the history of mankind, but also dozens of secrets hidden behind the veil of mysticism and the occult. Germany at that time became the center of strange rituals, searches for ancient artifacts, and legends about the supernatural. Ahnenerbe Society. In the 1930s, an organization emerged in Germany that still makes historians and researchers shudder. It was called Ahnenerbe, which translates as Heritage of the Ancestors. Created on the initiative of Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's closest associate, the society was supposed to study myths, ancient knowledge, and occult practices in order to find confirmation of the ideas about the superior Aryan race. In reality, the Ahnenerbe turned into one of the most mysterious structures of the Third Reich, absorbing a mixture of archaeology, mysticism, pseudoscience, and esotericism. Himmler was deeply fascinated by the idea that the German nation descended from an ancient civilization that possessed superior knowledge and magical powers. He sought evidence in history, myths, and even folklore. To this end, the Ahnenerbe sent expeditions around the world, to Scandinavia, Tibet, Africa, Crimea. These missions were not simply scientific. They had the character of occult searches, because the goal was to discover artifacts and ancient texts that could give Germany a mystical advantage. One of the areas of research was archaeology. The Ahnenerbe employees studied the ruins of ancient German settlements, conducted excavations in Europe to prove that it was the Germans who were the heirs of the northern race. The archives contain information that some expeditions were looking for the legendary Grail, others for the Spear of Destiny, the artifact that pierced Christ and which, according to legend, granted power over the world. These searches, which seemed crazy, were supported at the highest level of the state. Occult research occupied a special place in the society's activities. In the laboratories of the Ahnenerbe, they tried to study telepathy, magic, and even conducted experiments with hypnosis and attempts to connect with invisible forces. Some documents indicate that rituals were held in the Wewelsburg Castle, which was transformed into a mystical center for the SS, in which the leaders of the organization tried to call upon the power of ancient ancestors. The symbol of the Black Sun was laid out on the floor of one of the halls, a mysterious sign of 12 runes that became the emblem of a secret cult within the SS elite. Expeditions to Tibet remain no less mysterious. In the late 30s, Ahnenerbe researchers went there, supposedly to study the traditions of Buddhism. In reality, they were looking for the legendary Shambhala, the land of sages hidden in the mountains, where, according to legend, knowledge and powers capable of changing the course of history were kept. There are photographs of German officers next to lamas, as well as reports that Tibetan monks shared maps and ancient texts with them. Today it is impossible to say with certainty how serious these searches were and what exactly they managed to find. However, it is known that enormous resources were invested in such projects, and all this took place against the backdrop of preparations for war. For the German leadership, mysticism and pseudoscience became a tool for justifying ideology and a way to give military action a higher meaning. After the end of the war, the Allies confiscated the Ahnenerbe archives. Many documents disappeared, and some are still kept in closed funds. This only increases the aura of secrecy around the organization. It is believed that these papers may contain information about real discoveries or experiments, the results of which are deliberately hidden. Thus, the Ahnenerbe remains one of the darkest mysteries of the Second World War. It is not just a scientific society, but a real cult, combining mythology, occultism, and the ambitions of the political elite. And even after decades, it remains a symbol of how mysticism can intertwine with politics and turn into an instrument of power. Wewelsburg Castle as a Black Order center of the SS. Among the many symbols and places associated with the mysticism of Nazi Germany, Wewelsburg Castle occupies a special place. It is located in Westphalia and looks like an ordinary medieval fortress. However, in the hands of Heinrich Himmler, this castle turned into something more, into a mystical center, a kind of Black Vatican of the SS's, where power, occultism, and ancient myths were intertwined into a single system. Himmler was convinced that the SS was not just a military unit, but a new order designed to restore the spiritual greatness of the Aryan race. Wewelsburg Castle was to become the heart of this order. A special atmosphere was created inside, where each element had a symbolic meaning. The central place was the so-called Hall of the Supreme Knights, a round hall with 12 chairs arranged in a circle. These chairs were intended for the 12 top SS leaders, who were to form a kind of cabinet of shadows. In the center of the room was a coat of arms in the form of a wheel of 12 runes, the symbol of the Black Sun. Under the castle, there was another mystical hall called the Hall of the Dead. There was a round room with a domed ceiling and a symbolic altar. According to some reports, this hall contained urns containing the ashes of fallen SS officers who were not considered ordinary soldiers, but rather cult warriors. Secret rituals designed to strengthen the connection with ancestral spirits could also be held here, according to researchers. Wewelsburg was not just meant to be a castle, but a center of occult power for the Third Reich. Himmler dreamed of turning it into the ideological capital of the New World after Germany's victory. According to the architect's plan, a whole complex with temples, schools for officers, libraries of ancient knowledge, and places for mystical ceremonies were to be built around the castle. However, the war did not allow these plans to be completed. Legends around Wewelsburg multiplied. It was said that it was here that secret meetings of the Reich's top brass took place, that spells in ancient German were heard in the underground halls, and that the leaders of the order tried to summon forces capable of granting them victory. Some researchers even associate the Black Sun symbol with an attempt to create an energy portal or power concentrator, although there is no direct evidence of this. After the war, the castle passed into the hands of the Allies. Some of the premises were destroyed and the archives were confiscated. Today, Wewelsburg is open to tourists and has a museum, but many of the rooms still evoke a special sense of anxiety. The symbol of the Black Sun is preserved on the floor of the Hall of the High Knights, and even now it attracts supporters of mysticism and neo-pagan movements. Wewelsburg Castle has become the embodiment of how politics and megalomania can intertwine with mythology and mysticism. For some, it is just a monument of architecture and ideology. For others, it is a place of power, where events once took place that were more like rituals of secret orders than military meetings. And perhaps it is this mixture of reality and legend that makes Wewelsburg one of the most enigmatic symbols of the Third Reich. The Black Sun symbol and its meaning. Among the many symbols used by Germany during the Third Reich, a special place is occupied by the mysterious sign known as the Black Sun. Unlike the swastika, which was known and seen by millions of people, this symbol was hidden from the general public and was used exclusively in a narrow circle of SS leaders. Its image has been preserved on the floor of the Hall of the Supreme Knights of Wewelsburg Castle and still causes controversy, speculation, and mystical interest. The symbol is a circle with 12 rays in the form of runes, intertwined in a complex pattern. For some, it resembles a wheel, for others, a solar disk, or even a kind of energy vortex. Himmler, who is the main instigator of the use of the Black Sun, saw it as an ancient sign of power and a source of spiritual energy. He believed that the symbol originated from the Aryan tradition and was connected with ancient Germanic myths about divine light and hidden powers. Some researchers believe that the Black Sun was a kind of esoteric opposite to the ordinary sun. It personified not the bright source of life, but a hidden, dark energy, access to which only the chosen had. In SS mysticism, this sign symbolized the center of the order, the invisible core of power from which the officers of the Black Order drew inspiration. There is a version that the Black Sun was associated with the idea of the internal solar fire in a person. According to one of the esoteric concepts, a person has hidden energy similar to the rays of the sun, which can be awakened with the help of rituals and special practices. For the SS leaders, this symbol could serve as a reminder that each officer should strive to awaken the inner force and connect with some higher source. Interestingly, after the war, the Black Sun found a new life. This sign began to be actively used by various neo-pagan movements, occult groups, and mystical societies. For some, it has become a symbol of the revival of ancient knowledge. For others, a sign of a secret order whose roots go back to the Third Reich. There is even a conspiracy theory that the symbol is connected with Nazi attempts to create energy weapons or even portals to other dimensions, although there is, of course, no evidence for this. Today, the Black Sun continues to excite the imagination. It has appeared in books, films, computer games, and street symbols, often accompanied by a touch of mysticism and horror. Its mystery is further enhanced by the fact that very few official documents have been preserved in the archives about the exact meaning that Himmler and his inner circle attached to it. It is likely that the symbol was deliberately kept secret in order to maintain an aura of inaccessibility and power. Ultimately, the black sun became not only a symbol of Nazi mysticism, but also a universal sign associated with secret societies, dark cults, and the search for hidden knowledge. Its mystery lies in the fact that it is both simple in form and infinitely polysemantic in interpretation, and it is precisely this duality that makes it one of the most mystical symbols of the Second World War. The Nazis' search for the Holy Grail. Among the many legends that inspired the Nazi elite, the myth of the Holy Grail occupied a special place. This relic, associated with the Last Supper of Christ and the legends of King Arthur, had a much broader meaning in the minds of the occultists of the Third Reich. For them, the Grail was not just a sacred vessel, but a source of higher power, capable of changing the course of history. Interest in this relic was not accidental. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and the inspirer of the Reich's mystical projects, saw the Grail as a symbol of eternal victory and proof of the existence of a higher Aryan tradition. In his interpretation, the legend of the Grail indicated that it was the Aryans, not the Christians, who were the true heirs of sacred knowledge. Wewelsburg Castle was to become a new Camelot, and SS officers were to be a kind of Knights of the Grail. Researchers claim that Himmler was personally interested in the works of Otto Rahn, a German writer and historian who devoted his life to searching for this relic. Rahn studied medieval chronicles and legends, especially those related to southern France and the castle of Montségur, where the Cathars, a religious movement destroyed by the Crusades, had established themselves in the 13th century. According to legend, it was the Cathars who could keep the secret of the Grail. Otto Rahn went on expeditions, explored castle ruins, translated ancient manuscripts, and was convinced that the Grail really existed. His works attracted the attention of the SS leaders, and soon he found himself in the ranks of this organization, effectively becoming an official night explorer. In his books, he described the Grail not as a cup, but as a symbol of pure truth, sacred knowledge lost with the disappearance of the Cathars. It is believed that Rahn's search and interest in the Grail were used by Nazi propaganda to create an aura of a sacred mission. Himmler believed that possession of the relic would grant the Reich invincibility and power over the world. According to some reports, the Ahnenerbe expeditions to the Pyrenees and southern France were aimed specifically at finding the Grail. However, no evidence of the find was ever found. The tragic fate of Otto Rahn himself added a mystical touch to the story. He became disillusioned with Nazi ideology, although he continued to work in the SS. In 1939, he was found dead in the Alps. According to the official version, it was suicide, but many believe that his death was connected with his knowledge and too close attachment to secrets that were better kept silent. Today, the legend of the Nazi quest for the Holy Grail has become part of popular culture. It has been exploited by writers, filmmakers, and researchers, creating images of mysterious expeditions, hidden rituals, and mystical discoveries. But even beyond artistic interpretations, it remains clear that the Grail myth was an important part of the Reich's occult ideology. Ultimately, the Holy Grail was not only a religious symbol for the Nazi elite, but also a tool to justify the idea of being chosen. And although they never found the actual artifact, the very obsession with the legend shows how closely politics, mysticism, and ancient myths were intertwined in Nazi Germany. The legend of the Spear of Destiny in the hands of Hitler. Among the many mystical artifacts that have been the subject of legends for centuries, the Spear of Destiny, also known as the Holy Spear or the Spear of Longinus, occupies a special place. According to Christian tradition, it was with this weapon that a Roman soldier pierced the body of the crucified Jesus Christ to make sure of his death. Since then, the spear has been considered a source of mystical power and a symbol of power over the world. There was a belief: whoever owns the Spear of Destiny is able to control the fate of humanity, but if he loses it, he will inevitably fall. Even before coming to power, Hitler showed interest in ancient relics and sacred symbols. In his youth, living in Vienna, he often visited the Hofburg, the residence of the Austrian emperors. It was there, in the imperial treasury, that one of the most famous copies was kept, which was associated with the legend of Longinus. In the memoirs of contemporaries, it was noted that the young Hitler stood for hours in front of the display case with the relic, as if feeling its energy. Later, this scene turned into part of the mythology in which Hitler allegedly found his destiny precisely at this spear. According to one version, Hitler believed that it was the spear of destiny that would give him the power to carry out his grand plan, to seize Europe and establish a 1,000-year Reich. This idea fit into his worldview, where history was perceived not as a series of accidents, but as a struggle for mystical power. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, one of the first actions was to remove valuables from the Vienna treasury. The Spear of Destiny was moved to Nuremberg, a city that Hitler saw as a symbol of the new Germany and the center of his massive party rallies. For him, this was not just the removal of a relic, but an act of returning power to the hands of the chosen few. In Nuremberg, a special storage facility was built for the Spear of Destiny in the dungeon of the Church of St. Catherine. The artifact was guarded, and only a narrow circle of initiates had access to it. There were rumors that Nazi leaders performed secret rituals at the relic, considering it a source of victories and a symbol of spiritual superiority. It is not surprising that the legend of the Spear of Destiny became part of propaganda. In Nazi Germany, this relic was seen not just as a historical object, but as proof that Germany had gained the right to world domination. Newspapers and brochures hinted at the Reich's connection with ancient powers that supposedly always supported the chosen people. However, the fate of the spear was as dramatic as the history of the Third Reich. In the spring of 1945, when the Allied forces entered Nuremberg, they found the relic in storage. According to legend, just a few hours before Hitler's arrest, the Allies seized the Spear of Destiny. For supporters of mystical versions, this became proof that, having lost the artifact, Hitler lost his power and doomed himself to death. After the war, the relic was returned to Vienna, where it is still kept. Historians who have studied the spear note that its origin is ambiguous. At different times, there were several artifacts that claimed to be the real Spear of Longinus. However, the myth surrounding the relic turned out to be much stronger than any scientific arguments. Many researchers emphasize that the belief in the mystical power of artifacts was an important part of the Nazi elite's worldview. Even if the Spear of Destiny in Hitler's hands was only a medieval relic without sacred power, the very conviction of its significance influenced the decisions and actions of the Reich leadership. This belief gave them a sense of being chosen and confidence in their mission. Today, the story of the Spear of Destiny remains on the border between legend and reality. Some see it as an example of how myths can control consciousness and politics. Others see it as proof that even in the 20th century, rulers sought support in mystical symbols like ancient chieftains and priests. One way or another, the legend of the Spear of Destiny in the hands of Hitler has become one of the most striking examples of how mysticism intertwines with history. And even decades later, it reminds us that faith in sacred weapons and ancient artifacts can influence the fate of entire nations. SS expedition to Tibet in search of Shambhala. In the late 1930s, Third Reich Germany organized one of the most mysterious expeditions of the 20th century. We are talking about the SS journey to Tibet, officially presented as a scientific mission to study the culture, geography, and biology of the region. But behind this scientific shell was hidden a much more mystical goal, the search for the legendary land of Shambhala, a mythical center of wisdom and power mentioned in Buddhist and Hindu legends. The expedition was led by Ernst Schaefer, a young German zoologist and traveler who already had experience of expeditions to Asia. His mission to Tibet in 1938 to 1939 became one of the most high-profile actions of the Ahnenerbe Society. The SS allocated enormous resources to the expedition, and Heinrich Himmler personally stood behind its organization, convinced that Tibet could hold traces of an ancient Aryan civilization and the key to a mystical force capable of changing the world. Shambhala is described in Eastern traditions as a hidden kingdom, hidden somewhere in the mountains of Central Asia. It is believed that great teachers live there, keepers of secret knowledge, who can open the path to superhuman wisdom and power for the chosen ones. For Himmler and his entourage, this myth coincided with their desire to find the source of Aryan superiority and evidence of the ancient roots of the German nation. The expedition arrived in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, where the German scientists established contacts with local lamas. They conducted anthropological measurements of the population, collected plant and animal samples, and studied traditions and legends. However, the real interest was centered around ancient texts and oral traditions about Shambhala. According to some reports, llamas actually shared stories about the hidden country with the Germans and showed maps with mysterious places in the mountains. There are photographs of SS officers standing next to Tibetan monks. These images still excite the imagination because they personify the strange union of the Nazi German military machine and the spiritual tradition of the East. Some researchers claim that the Germans took from Tibet not only collections of plants and animals, but also ancient manuscripts containing descriptions of meditative practices and mystical knowledge. There is also a version that the expedition was looking not only for Shambhala, but also for evidence of the hollow earth hypothesis, a theory popular among Nazi mystics, according to which hidden civilizations exist inside the planet. It is said that the llamas hinted to the German researchers about underground worlds that could be connected to the legend of Shambhala. Although the expedition officially ended without any sensational discoveries, its results were kept in the SS archives. Some documents were destroyed at the end of the war, while others are still classified. This gave rise to many theories that the Germans had managed to find traces of hidden knowledge and bring it back to Europe. After the war, a conspiracy theory emerged in esoteric circles, according to which Tibetan monks were found in Berlin, in a destroyed bunker after Germany's capitulation. Their corpses were allegedly found among the rubble, which gave rise to rumors about a secret connection between the Reich and Tibetan teachers. There is no documentary evidence of this, but the legend lives on to this day. The Tibet expedition was one of the most striking examples of how Nazi Germany combined politics, ideology, and mysticism. For Himmler and his entourage, it was not just a scientific project, but an attempt to touch an ancient secret that could strengthen power and grant supernatural advantages. Today, the history of this expedition is perceived as being on the border between myth and reality. On the one hand, there are reports and photographs that confirm that the Germans really did study the culture and nature of Tibet. On the other hand, numerous rumors about the search for Shambhala make it part of the occult legacy of the Third Reich. And perhaps this is precisely where its mystery lies. We do not know whether the Germans ever found even the slightest trace of the legendary country, but the very fact of their obsession with the search for an invisible kingdom shows how deeply mysticism penetrated into the heart of the political and military machine of Nazi Germany. Secret rituals at Wewelsburg Castle. The Wewelsburg Castle in Westphalia was already a symbol of Heinrich Himmler's mystical project, but not only architectural plans were born around it, but a whole system of rituals that were supposed to turn the SS into a kind of occult order. For Himmler, this castle was not just a residence, but a sacred center where the new myth of the German nation and its chosenness was born. Inside the castle, a special place was occupied by the Hall of the Supreme Knights, a round room with 12 niches for chairs. It was believed that each chair symbolized one of the Knights of the Order, that is, high-ranking SS officers. By analogy with the legends of King Arthur, this was supposed to be a kind of round table of the new era, where not only military but also sacred tasks were decided. In the center of the hall was the symbol of the Black Sun, consisting of 12 runes. It served as an energy center for the rituals. Beneath the castle was the Hall of the Dead. This dark domed room contained an altar, and niches could hold urns containing the ashes of fallen officers. According to some documents and oral histories, rituals were held here to honor the spirits of the ancestors. Himmler believed that the death of an officer did not sever his connection with the order, and that the spirits were to return to the living to strengthen their power. The rituals at Wewelsburg Castle combined elements of ancient Germanic cults, pseudo-Christian symbolism, and mystical practices inspired by the esoteric societies of the early 20th century. Officers could take part in ceremonies where they swore allegiance to the order, shed blood in the name of the Reich, and hear the voice of the ancestors. These rituals were intended to create a sense of belonging to a special elite, standing above ordinary people. Some researchers claim that rituals may have included meditation, the recitation of spells in Old German or Latin, and the use of symbols associated with runic magic. Runes were not just signs for the SS, but keys to energy that were supposed to connect them to ancient sources of power. An important part of the rituals was the celebration of special dates, such as the solstices. It was on these days that the highest officers would gather, and ceremonies reminiscent of pagan holidays would be held in the castle. It was believed that at such moments the forces of nature reached their maximum, and the order could connect to these energies. Interestingly, many elements of these rituals were deliberately hidden from the general public. Even ordinary SS members did not know what was happening in Wewelsburg. The castle remained a closed place, where only a select few were allowed. This created an aura of mystery and strengthened the belief in the special status of the leaders. After the war, the Allies found many artifacts in the castle that were associated with occult symbolism. Runic signs, remains of ritual objects, and architectural elements created with a clearly esoteric purpose were discovered. Many documents describing the rituals disappeared. Some were destroyed by the Nazis themselves, some were taken to secret archives. This gave rise to even more rumors and speculation about what exactly was happening within these walls. Today, Wewelsburg is open to tourists, and anyone can see the black sun symbol on the floor. However, the sense of mystery remains. Too many questions remain unanswered. Were these rituals just theater to create a sense of specialness among the officers? Or did they really believe that they could draw power from other worlds? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. The secret rituals at Wewelsburg Castle became an important part of the mythology of Nazi mysticism. They show that the leadership of the Reich sought to create not only a military, but also a spiritual structure based on the cult of power, death, and ancestors. And this is what makes Wewelsburg one of the darkest symbols of the Third Reich, a place where politics and magic intertwined into a single cult of power, using astrology and the prophecies of Nostradamus. Although the Third Reich relied on the image of a scientific state, there was a hidden fascination with esotericism and astrology within it. Heinrich Himmler and some of his inner circle believed that the fate of empires could be predicted and even changed with the help of the stars and ancient prophecies. One of the key sources of such inspiration were the texts of the 16th century French seer Michael Nostradamus, whose cryptic quatrains were interpreted as predictions of future wars and the fall of empires. Interest in Nostradamus arose back in the 1920s, when his books began to be actively republished in Germany. After Hitler came to power, astrology acquired special significance. It was seen as a tool for strengthening faith in the predetermined mission of the Reich. Articles appeared in the press claiming that Nostradamus' predictions allegedly pointed to a great leader from the West who would lead the Aryans to dominance. These interpretations gave the public the feeling that events were unfolding according to fate. Nazi propaganda used special astrologers and occultists. One of them was Karl Ernst Kraft, a student of the famous Swiss astrologer Karl Krause. Kraft gained fame for supposedly predicting the bombing of Britain and even an assassination attempt on Hitler. His predictions interested the leadership, and for a time he enjoyed the attention of the elite, although he was later arrested on suspicion of having connections with enemies of the Reich. Astrology played a special role in the information war. When Germany launched a campaign against France and England, the astrological front was put into action. The propaganda ministry instructed specialists to use Nostradamus' texts to create leaflets that were distributed among the enemy population. They claimed that the great seer had predicted the defeat of France and the fall of the British Empire. These texts were presented in the form of ancient prophecies and were intended to undermine the enemy's morale by instilling the idea that resistance was pointless since it was written in the stars. Interestingly, the Allies quickly responded with mirror methods. Astrologers and analysts also worked in London, creating fake quatrains of Nostradamus, interpreting them in favor of the victory of democratic countries. Thus, on both sides, the ancient text was transformed into a weapon of psychological warfare, in which mysticism was used as a means of propaganda. It cannot be said that all Nazi leaders believed in astrology in the same way. Hitler had a contradictory attitude towards it. On the one hand, he was familiar with predictions, but on the other, he did not like open discussions of such topics. However, Heinrich Himmler, Rudolf Hess, and some of his entourage were actively interested in esotericism. Hess, known for his eccentricity, even consulted personal astrologers before making decisions. His famous flight to England in 1941 was, according to some accounts, inspired by astrological calculations that promised a turn of fate. After the failure of Hess's mission, the attitude towards astrology at the top of the Reich changed. Hitler ordered an operation against occultists, a mass campaign of arrests of astrologers, mediums, and fortune-tellers. Nevertheless, despite the ban, the secret interest in prophecies did not disappear. Himmler continued to look for answers in them, and even thought about creating his own school of astrology for the SS. As for Nostradamus, his figure remained in the spotlight until the end of the war. His quatrains continued to be interpreted both in Nazi Germany and among its enemies. For some, he was a prophet who predicted catastrophes. For others, he was just a convenient tool whose text could be interpreted in a way that suited the moment. The impact of these prophecies on actual events is difficult to measure, but it is clear that belief in predestination and mystical destiny played a role in shaping the psychology of the Reich leaders and was used as a powerful propaganda tool. Thus, the use of astrology and the prophecies of Nostradamus in the Third Reich shows how ancient mystical texts can be turned into weapons in the hands of politicians. This was not just a folkloric interest, but a conscious attempt to connect war with a sense of destiny, instilling in people the idea that their struggle and suffering had long been written in the stars. The mysticism of Heinrich Himmler and his interest in secret orders. Of all the leaders of the Third Reich, it was Heinrich Himmler who stood out for his greatest obsession with mysticism, occult practices, and secret societies. While Hitler sought to turn mythology into a tool of political propaganda, Himmler perceived it as something personal, spiritual, and sacred. He saw himself not simply as a politician or military leader, but as a kind of grand master of the order, who was supposed to revive ancient traditions and transform the SS into a new knightly cult. Himmler had been interested in history since his youth, especially the medieval knightly orders. He admired the Templars and the Teutonic Order, which he saw as models of discipline, loyalty, and spiritual superiority. Over time, this fascination turned into a real mania. He sought to reproduce a system in which SS officers would not be mere soldiers, but guardians of secret knowledge, a chosen caste called upon to govern the future of the world. It was no coincidence that Wewelsburg Castle became his main project. Here Himmler created the symbolic center of the new SS order. In the hall with the symbol of the Black Sun, he was going to hold meetings of the 12 Supreme Knights, the leaders of the SS, and he saw himself as a grand master, similar to the leader of the Templars. For him, history was not just the past, it was a source of power that could be revived with the help of rituals and symbols. Himmler sought to combine science, archaeology, and mysticism. He became the main patron of the Ahnenerbe, which sent expeditions in search of evidence of the Aryan heritage. But behind the scientific shell of these expeditions was hidden his personal belief that ancient artifacts and sacred texts could grant Germany special power. He sought confirmation of the legends of Shambhala, Atlantis, and the Grail, considering them not myths, but real evidence of ancient knowledge. Himmler's interest in the occult manifested itself in everyday life. He was convinced that runes possessed magical energy. The SS symbolism included runic signs selected by him. Each rune had a sacred meaning. Sieg symbolized victory, Odal, heritage, Tauber, strength and war. These signs not only carried a propaganda meaning, but were also supposed to serve, according to his plan, as keys to ancient energy. Himmler was also interested in ideas of reincarnation. He believed that people's souls passed from century to century, and he considered himself the reincarnation of an ancient German leader. His contemporaries noted that he spoke of past lives as if he actually felt a connection to long-gone eras. It was this belief in the transmigration of souls that fueled his concept of an eternal order, whose members were to continue their mission even after death. Evidence also suggests that Himmler tried to create his own set of rituals for the SS. His plans included pagan-style weddings and funerals, using symbols of the sun, fire, and earth instead of Christian traditions. He wanted new generations of SS to be raised in an atmosphere of ancestor worship and strength, and to see Christianity as a weak and alien religion. Some historians claim that Himmler even dreamed of creating a new religion based on the SS cult. It was to combine the mythology of the ancient Germans, elements of Hinduism and Buddhism, and ideas of racial superiority. This religion would not just be a spiritual system, but an instrument of control over society, where SS officers would act as priests and guardians of secret knowledge. After the war, many documents related to Himmler's mystical projects were destroyed. However, the surviving evidence and architectural plans of Wewelsburg make it clear that he perceived mysticism not as a game, but as a reality. For him, magic and symbols were part of power, and the SS order was an instrument for creating a new sacred Europe. The mysticism of Heinrich Himmler remains one of the most sinister aspects of the history of the Third Reich. It shows how closely politics, ideology, and occult beliefs were intertwined in Germany. And perhaps it was this mixture of fanaticism and mysticism that gave the Nazi regime the terrible energy that allowed it to subjugate millions of people and unleash a war that killed tens of millions. Ahnenerbe experiments in telepathy and magic. The Ahnenerbe, founded on the initiative of Heinrich Himmler, was officially positioned as a research institute studying the history and culture of the Germanic peoples. But behind the facade of scientific activity lurked a much darker and mystical side. Within the walls of the Ahnenerbe, experiments were conducted that today sound like the plot of a mystical novel, attempts to use telepathy, magical rituals, and supernatural powers for the needs of the Third Reich. Himmler sincerely believed that spiritual energy and hidden human abilities could be turned into weapons. His interest in the occult was fueled by the idea that the ancient Aryans possessed secret knowledge that had been lost over the centuries, and that the SS could recover this knowledge and use it to conquer the world. That is why the Ahnenerbe became a laboratory not only for archaeological research, but also for experiments on the border between science and mysticism. One of the areas of research was telepathy. Experiments were conducted in laboratories in which mediums or specially trained employees tried to transmit thoughts at a distance. There is evidence that concentration camp prisoners participated in these experiments, who were forced to be guinea pigs. The Nazis hoped that telepathy would allow them to control soldiers on the battlefield, transmitting orders without radio communication, or to read the thoughts of enemies. There is no official confirmation of the success of such experiments, but the very fact that a government agency allocated resources for such experiments speaks of the seriousness of their intentions. No less interesting was the direction connected with magical rituals. In the Ahnenerbe, there were divisions engaged in the study of ancient spells, symbols, and runes. Runes were seen as keys to energy that could influence reality. Runic magic was used in the creation of SS symbols and, according to some researchers, in secret ceremonies held at Wewelsburg Castle. Some documents that survived the war indicate that the Ahnenerbe attempted to combine magical practices with scientific methods. For example, rituals were accompanied by biofield measurements, experiments with hypnosis, and the use of psychotropic substances. It was assumed that special states of consciousness could open access to higher energy or collective intelligence. A separate area concerned the search for ways to contact other forces. The archives mentioned experiments with summoning spirits, automatic writing practices, and the use of mediums to receive messages. Some versions claim that Nazi occultists tried to contact ancient Aryan teachers, or even extraterrestrial civilizations. Such stories seem fantastic, but they continue to excite researchers today. There is a version that it was within the framework of the Ahnenerbe that experiments were conducted to create magic weapons. One of the projects was the so-called psychotronic front, which proposed using collective meditations and rituals to influence the enemy, instilling fear, disorientation, or even illness. Of course, none of these experiments yielded tangible results in real combat, but the very fact of their existence suggests that the Nazi elite did not consider such methods pointless. After the war, many of the Ahnenerbe's materials fell into the hands of the Allies. Some of the documents disappeared without a trace, giving rise to legends that the US and USSR secretly continued research into telepathy and psychotronic weapons. At the height of the Cold War, there were indeed programs to study extrasensory perception, which may indirectly confirm the interest in the Nazi legacy. Today, the Ahnenerbe experiments are perceived as a sinister mixture of science, mysticism, and cruelty. Prisoners became test subjects in experiments that tested hypnosis, suggestion, and thought transference. SS officers took part in rituals that were more reminiscent of pagan mysteries than scientific research. For the leaders of the Reich, all this was part of one idea: to create a new world in which Germany would have not only weapons and an army, but also spiritual superiority. The experiments in telepathy and magic in the Ahnenerbe remained without visible results, but they reflect the spirit of the era, when ideology and mysticism intertwined, creating a terrifying symbiosis. This part of the story still raises questions. Did the Nazis really believe in the possibility of controlling reality through consciousness? Or was it just a tool for psychological control over their followers? One way or another, the Ahnenerbe went down in history, not only as a symbol of cruel experiments and pseudoscience, but also as one of the darkest projects where human life was subordinated to the idea of searching for supernatural power. The Hollow Earth theory and the Nazi polar expeditions. One of the most fantastic and frightening ideas that received attention in Nazi Germany was the theory of the Hollow Earth. For the mystical believers within the Third Reich, it did not seem crazy. It was believed that there were vast spaces inside the planet where ancient civilizations could be located or knowledge could be stored that could change the course of history. Heinrich Himmler and the Ahnenerbe saw this hypothesis not as fiction, but as the key to finding the lost heritage of the Aryan race. The idea itself was not new. In the 19th century, it was discussed by theosophists and occultists, linking it with the myths of Shambhala and Agartha. By the beginning of the 20th century, it had gained particular popularity among European esotericists. In their view, the poles were the gateway to a hidden world inhabited by the keepers of ancient wisdom. For the Nazis, this was more than just a hobby. They hoped to find evidence in the Arctic and Antarctica that the Germans were descended from an ancient civilization that had sunk into the depths of the earth. In 1938, Germany organized an expedition to Antarctica on the ship Schwaben. The officially stated goal was to explore areas for whaling stations and to map new lands. But there is evidence that the expedition had hidden goals, to find places where bases could be established, as well as to explore glaciers in the hope of finding entrances to underground spaces. The area explored by the expedition was named New Swabia. German planes photographed glaciers and mountain ranges, and later rumors emerged that the photographs included caves and faults that resembled portals into the depths. Interest in this idea was also fueled by other Ahnenerbe projects. In the archives, there are references to the development of special devices that were supposedly used to record reflections of the inner world through the atmosphere. For the scientific community, this seemed absurd, but for the Reich leadership, this was another way to prove the myths on which the ideology was built. After the war, the legends about the Hollow Earth only grew stronger. Versions appeared that the Germans managed to build a secret base in Antarctica, known as Pt.1, and even transported scientists, submarines, and equipment there. In the late 1940s, the United States carried out a massive operation called Operation High Jump under Admiral Richard Byrd, officially for training in polar climates. But rumors claimed that the operation was connected with the search for German fortifications, and some even spoke of encounters with flying discs. Historians consider these legends part of the mythology that grew up around the defeated Reich, but the fact remains. Germany did show interest in the polar regions, and the Swabia expedition was real. For the Nazi elite, this was a way to tap into secrets that could give their ideology an additional aura of selectivity. Even if they did not find any entrances to the inner world, the idea itself shows how deeply mysticism penetrated the political and military projects of the Third Reich. Secret bases of the Third Reich in Antarctica. In the late 1930s, the Third Reich showed interest in the most remote and mysterious continent on Earth, Antarctica. To the outside world, the expedition sent out in 1938 on the ship Schwaben looked like a scientific mission with economic goals, finding places for whaling stations, mapping poorly studied territories, and strengthening Germany's prestige as a maritime power. However, behind the official reports, there was another side to the story, much more mystical and disturbing. The SS leadership and the Ahnenerbe saw Antarctica not only as a harsh desert of ice, but also as a possible entrance to worlds spoken of in ancient legends. The expedition surveyed a huge stretch of the Queen Maud Land coastline and mapped new territories, calling them New Swabia. The planes accompanying the explorers took hundreds of aerial photographs, recording mountains, glaciers, and unusual structures that later gave rise to many legends. Rumors later emerged that these images included images of caves and cracks in the ice massifs, resembling entrances to colossal underground spaces. For many, this detail was proof that the Germans were not simply looking for convenient bays, but for gateways to unknown worlds. Himmler and his entourage were convinced that Antarctica could hide traces of ancient civilizations, or even a base left over from Atlantis. The occult literature of the time often mentioned that there were secret cities or passages to the inner Earth under the ice. That is why the Ahnenerbe developed projects that involved creating long-term bases in Antarctica, where scientific research, military technology, and mystical searches could be combined. There is a version that the Swabia expedition laid the foundation for the construction of the so-called Base 211. According to rumors, the Germans equipped underground storage facilities, submarine hangars, and laboratories in the hidden bays of the continent. Legends claim that equipment, scientists, and even rare artifacts obtained in other expeditions were secretly transported there. To some, this sounds like pure science fiction, but supporters of the theory point out that Germany really did have the technology to transport goods over long distances and could build shelters even in such harsh conditions. After the war, even more mysteries surrounded this story. In 1947, the United States of America organized a large-scale operation called High Jump under the leadership of Admiral Richard Byrd. Officially, it was presented as naval exercises in polar winter conditions, but its scale and the composition of the fleet made many doubt this version. The operation involved dozens of ships, including an aircraft carrier, and thousands of men. It looked more like a military expedition than a scientific mission. Conspiracy theorists later claimed that the real purpose of High Jump was to verify rumors of German bases in New Swabia. Stories of American ships encountering unusual forces became part of the arsenal of conspiracy theories. Some said that the fleet encountered flying discs created by the Nazis using unknown technology and suffered losses, after which the expedition was suddenly abandoned. Admiral Byrd did mention in an interview a threat from the South Pole capable of attacking the United States of America sooner than expected. These words became the basis for the mythology of the last stronghold of the Reich in Antarctica. No documentary evidence of the existence of Base 211 has been found, but the fact of Germany's interest in Antarctica remains indisputable. The Swabia expedition left behind thousands of photographs, detailed maps, and reports. After the war, some of these materials disappeared, and access to others was limited. It was this lack of clarity that created an aura of mystery that continues to this day. Modern researchers point out that Antarctica's practical use for the Reich could have been the creation of strategic supply points and testing grounds. But for the mystics and ideologists of the Ahnenerbe, it was much more a gateway to another world. In their view, evidence of an ancient Aryan civilization, traces of Atlantis, or even entrances to underground worlds inhabited by the keepers of secret knowledge could have been hidden under the ice. Even after decades, legends about the secret bases of the Reich continue to excite the imagination. Some see them as a symbol of mad obsession, others, a possible hint at forgotten pages of history. Perhaps the Nazis really tried to gain a foothold in Antarctica, but the real scale of their efforts remains unknown. The ice reliably keeps its secrets, and the myth of Base 211 lives on in books, films, and science fiction theories, making Antarctica one of the most mystical places on Earth. SS contacts with Tibetan lamas and occultists. In the history of the Third Reich, a special place is occupied by the attempts of its leaders to establish contacts with the bearers of ancient knowledge of the East. One of the most mysterious episodes remains the interaction of the SS with Tibetan lamas and representatives of occult schools, which took place in the late 30s and left many secrets. For the Reich leadership, Tibet was not just a remote and isolated territory, but a real repository of sacred wisdom associated with the myths of Shambhala, Agartha, and other hidden worlds. Heinrich Himmler, deeply fascinated by esotericism, believed that Tibetan monks could hold the key to knowledge that would help Germany in its quest for world domination. The expedition to Tibet, organized by the Ahnenerbe in 1938, was the outward expression of this interest. Formally, it had scientific goals, studying the flora, fauna, anthropology, and geography of the region. In practice, SS officers tried to establish direct contact with spiritual teachers, whom they viewed as intermediaries between the human world and higher powers. German researchers met with lamas, studied Buddhist texts, participated in religious ceremonies, and tried to adopt elements of practices that, in their eyes, could strengthen the inner strength of the Reich. There is evidence that Tibetan lamas shared with the Germans not only cultural knowledge, but also legends about hidden countries and great teachers. Shambhala, the mystical kingdom where the guardians of wisdom and power live, was especially often mentioned. For the Tibetans, this legend had a spiritual character, connected with inner perfection. But the Nazis interpreted it differently. They saw in it an indication of a real place where a source of energy or an ancient civilization connected with their concept of the Aryan heritage could be located. The expedition's photographs showed SS officers standing next to Tibetan lamas. The images look almost surreal today. Soldiers in black uniforms and monks in traditional robes standing side by side in the heart of Lhasa. The images became emblematic of a strange and disturbing alliance between politics, the occult, and spirituality. Historians note that during their stay in Tibet, the Germans collected not only scientific collections, but also relics, books, and maps that could have sacred significance. Some of these materials disappeared without a trace after the war, which gave rise to new legends about knowledge taken to the Reich. Conspiracy theories claim that some lamas agreed to cooperate with the Germans, seeing them as allies against British influence in the region. According to these rumors, the monks shared meditation practices, texts on inner energy, and legends about the underworld. After the war, there were even stories about Tibetan bodies in SS uniforms being found in ruined Berlin, which seemed to confirm their close ties. These stories have not been documented, but the fact that they appeared shows how closely mythology has become intertwined with history. The SS's interest in Tibet and its lamas was not accidental. In esoteric circles in Europe, there had been a belief since the late 19th century that the East held traces of an ancient civilization that preceded modern humanity. Theosophists, occultists, and researchers spoke of Shambhala and Agartha as real places, and of lamas as the keepers of this knowledge. The Nazis took up this idea and made it part of their ideology. For them, contacts with lamas were not just a cultural exchange, but a search for confirmation of their own myths about the superior race and its mystical origins. After the war, the Allies carefully studied the Ahnenerbe archives, but a significant portion of the materials disappeared. This gave scope for many theories. Some claimed that the Germans had indeed found confirmation of the legends about Shambhala and had taken manuscripts describing ancient technologies from Tibet. Others believed that contacts with lamas were purely political in nature, and there was no mysticism in them. However, even skeptics admit that the very idea of SS cooperation with Tibetan spiritual leaders seems too unusual to be perceived as a simple coincidence. Today, the story of these contacts is seen as an example of how the Third Reich combined politics, science, and the occult into a single project. Tibet became for the Nazis a symbol of an unattainable mystery that they sought to touch. The lamas probably saw them as another delegation from a distant world, unaware that their stories and texts would be used in the Reich's ideological machine. The SS's contacts with Tibetan lamas and occultists remain on the border between myth and reality. We know about the expedition's photographs, reports, and findings, but much is hidden or lost. Perhaps it is precisely this understatement that makes the topic so fascinating. It reminds us that the Third Reich's war was not only fought on the battlefield, but also in the realm of ideas, symbols, and mysticism. For the Nazi elite, this was no less important than weapons and tanks, and that is why their interest in Tibet and its lamas remains one of the darkest and most mysterious pages in the history of World War II. The search for Atlantis and Aryan roots. One of the most obsessive ideas of the Nazi elite was the desire to prove that the German nation was the heir to an ancient civilization that possessed superior knowledge and spiritual strength. In this search, a special place was occupied by the legend of Atlantis, the mythical continent described by Plato as the center of an advanced culture that disappeared as a result of a catastrophe. For Himmler and the Ahnenerbe, Atlantis was not a fiction, but a real historical fact that could explain the origin of the Aryans and justify the ideology of superiority. Nazi researchers considered Atlantis to be the ancestral home of the white race, which allegedly, after the destruction of the continent, settled all over the world, leaving traces in Egypt, India, Tibet, and Scandinavia. In this concept, the Germans were presented as direct descendants of the Atlanteans, who inherited their spiritual strength and desire for domination. That is why the Ahnenerbe expeditions were sent to different corners of the Earth, from the Himalayas to Northern Europe, from Antarctica to Africa. Each artifact, each legend was considered as possible evidence of a connection with the vanished civilization. Megalithic monuments of antiquity were of particular interest. Ruins in South America, stone circles in Europe, Egyptian pyramids, and even Scandinavian sagas were interpreted as the legacy of the Atlanteans. In these stones and texts, Nazi occultists saw not just remnants of the past, but indications of ancient knowledge that could be used to create a new world. It was believed that Atlantis gave humanity the first technologies, and its descendants preserved secret sciences, access to which was supposed to be granted only to a chosen people. The idea of Atlantis was closely intertwined with the search for Aryan roots. In the Nazi interpretation, the word Aryan meant not only an ethnic group, but also a spiritual community associated with higher wisdom. The Atlanteans were depicted as the first Aryans, whose bright appearance and knowledge were contrasted with the lower peoples. This mythology became the basis for justifying the racial policy of the Reich and gave it an aura of predetermination. Within the Ahnenerbe, there were entire departments devoted to the study of myths about Atlantis. They collected texts by Plato, legends of the Mayans and Incas, and Hindu epics about sunken lands. Particular attention was paid to northern legends about the country of Thula, which was perceived as another name for Atlantis. It was believed that it was from Thula or Atlantis that the first teachers of humanity came. This idea was later transformed into the legend of the Thule Society, which in fact became one of the ideological sources of National Socialism. Some expeditions searched for concrete material evidence. In Scandinavia, they looked for ancient sanctuaries and stone symbols that could point to the northern origin of the Atlanteans. In Tibet, they studied the legends of Shambhala, trying to connect it with the sunken continent. Even the expedition to Antarctica was partly explained by the fact that the remains of an ancient civilization could be hidden under the ice. For Himmler, all these searches had not only scientific, but also sacred significance. He believed that finding traces of Atlantis would give the Reich proof of its divine destiny. After the war, many documents related to the Ahnenerbe's Atlantic research disappeared. This gave rise to endless versions of what the Germans had found, something more than just a myth. Conspiracy theorists claimed that the Reich archives contain maps of sunken lands and descriptions of technologies lost by modern humanity. Some believed that the Nazis were trying to use this knowledge to create weapons. Others that it was about spiritual practices that allowed one to control consciousness and energy. However, even without mysticism, the fact remains. The Third Reich actively used the legend of Atlantis as part of its ideology. This myth inspired the people with a sense of being chosen, and gave the elite a sense of connection with ancient forces. In the eyes of the Nazis, Atlantis was not so much the past as the future, a symbol of the revival of a great civilization, of which they considered themselves heirs. Today, the search for Atlantis and Aryan roots in the Third Reich looks like a mixture of pseudoscience, mysticism, and political propaganda. But it was this mixture that proved extremely effective. It allowed cruel decisions to be justified by reference to ancient laws and war, by reference to the fate of the chosen people. And perhaps this is why the myth of Atlantis continues to live on to this day, preserving its dark charm and reminding us how easily a legend can turn into an instrument of power. SS rituals based on ancient Germanic myths. When Heinrich Himmler created the SS, he did not want to see it as just a military organization subject to discipline and orders. His goal was to transform the SS into a new knightly order in which military service would be combined with mysticism, sacred symbols, and a special system of rituals. This is why the internal culture of the SS was based not on traditional Christian rites, but on reconstructed and reinvented rituals inspired by ancient Germanic myths. Himmler was convinced that the German nation was the heir to a special spiritual heritage dating back to the times of ancient tribes who worshipped gods and the forces of nature. He considered Christianity to be an alien element that had weakened the people and deprived them of their true strength. Therefore, within the SS, he sought to replace traditional religious practices with new rituals that were supposed to create a sense of connection with the original Aryan faith. Ceremonies associated with the stages of a person's life occupied a special place. Thus, the marriages of SS officers had to be concluded not in a church, but according to a special pagan rite. Wedding ceremonies took place in symbolic halls or outdoors, where fire, water, and earth served as sacred elements. The newlyweds swore allegiance to each other, not in front of a cross, but in front of symbols of the sun and runes, which were seen as keys to ancient energy. These rites were meant to reinforce the idea of the family as a unit of the new Aryan nation. Funeral rituals were no less significant. In Wavelsburg, there was the so-called Hall of the Dead, where, according to Himmler's plan, urns with the ashes of fallen SS officers were to be kept. It was believed that death did not break the connection with the order, but only transferred a person to the state of an eternal warrior who continued to protect his brothers. Funerals were accompanied by the lighting of torches, the reading of texts based on the mythology of Valhalla, and runic spells that were supposed to strengthen the spiritual connection between the living and the dead. Seasonal holidays occupied a special place. Solstices and equinoxes were celebrated in the SS as special days of strength. During the summer solstice, officers gathered for ceremonies with bonfires symbolizing the eternal sun and the vitality of the people. The winter solstice was seen as a time of rebirth, when darkness gave way to light, and this image was used as a symbol of the eternal rebirth of the Reich. Such holidays were intended to replace Christian Christmas and Easter, cementing the new Aryan religion. Runes played a vital role in all rituals. They not only decorated uniforms and buildings, but were also used as sacred signs endowed with magical powers. Runes were drawn on altars, they decorated SS rings, they were present in marriage and burial ceremonies. Himmler believed that runes were the universal language of the ancient Germans, allowing access to the energies of the past and connecting the order to a sacred source of power. These rituals had not only a mystical, but also a psychological significance. They created an atmosphere of special selectivity, separating SS officers from the rest of society. A member of the order felt that he belonged to a special caste, whose life and death had a sacred meaning. This strengthened discipline and turned the SS into a community based not simply on orders, but on a deep sense of belonging to an eternal order. After the war, the Allies found documents in the archives that confirmed the development of a whole complex of rituals and ceremonies for the SS. Some texts contained rewritten ancient Germanic myths and even new sagas created specifically to give the order historical depth. Some of this material disappeared, giving rise to rumors that they may have contained descriptions of real mystical practices. Today, SS rituals are perceived as a mixture of theatrical rites, ideological propaganda, and occult experiments. But in their time, they had a huge impact, forming a special spiritual atmosphere within the order. For Himmler, this was not a game, but an attempt to build a new religion in which ancient Germanic myths became the basis for the creation of a 1,000-year Reich. These rituals show how deeply politics, ideology, and mysticism were intertwined in the Third Reich. They were an integral part of the project to transform the SS into a Black Order, whose power extended not only to the physical world, but also to the world of symbols, myths, and spiritual representations. And that is what makes them one of the darkest examples of how ancient myths can be used to create a modern cult of power. The mystery of the Nuremberg trials and the missing documents about the Ahnenerbe. After the end of World War II, the world was waiting for all the secrets of the Third Reich to be revealed. The Nuremberg trials were supposed to be not only a trial of criminals, but also a moment when humanity would learn the whole truth about the mechanisms of power, crimes, and hidden projects of Nazi Germany. Key figures were in the dock, and mountains of archives, reports, and secret documents fell into the hands of the Allies. However, it was at this point that one of the most disturbing mysteries emerged: the disappearance of a significant portion of the materials related to the Ahnenerbe. This organization, created by Heinrich Himmler, was officially listed as a research institute studying history and culture, but in reality, it was engaged in archaeological expeditions, the search for mystical artifacts, experiments on people, and developments that mix science with the occult. When the Allies entered Germany, the Ahnenerbe archives represented a huge array of information. They contained descriptions of expeditions to Tibet and Antarctica, protocols of experiments in camps, reports of telepathic experiments, research into ancient runes, and legends of Atlantis. These documents could shed light on many dark pages of Nazi mysticism. But a significant part of the archive disappeared. Already during the preparation for the Nuremberg trials, it became clear that many cases related to the Ahnenerbe were not presented in court. Some papers were officially listed as lost in the chaos of the last days of the war, others were classified as top secret and were confiscated by the Allied secret services. As a result, the Nuremberg trials barely touched on the occult side of the Reich, and the Ahnenerbe Society remained in the shadow of other accusations. This raised many questions. Why did such important materials disappear? Were they destroyed by the Nazis themselves, who sought to hide traces of their experiments? Or did the Allies deliberately conceal these documents? There is a version that the secret services of the United States of America and the Soviet Union took the archives for their own research. There are facts in favor of this. Already during the Cold War, both the USA and the USSR conducted projects to study telepathy, psychotronic weapons, and influence on consciousness. It is possible that Nazi developments became the basis for these programs. What makes the situation particularly mysterious is that some of the people involved with the Ahnenerbe escaped harsh punishment. Some of the employees were convicted, but many ended up in the service of the new authorities. The scientists involved in the experiments were secretly taken to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip, or ended up in the USSR. There, they continued their work, but under the control of their new masters. This confirms the idea that the Allies were interested not only in punishment, but also in the use of Nazi knowledge. The disappearance of the documents gave rise to more mystical versions. According to one of them, the archives of the Ahnenerbe contained materials about the found artifacts, possibly connected with the legends of the Grail, the Spear of Destiny, or Shambhala. These finds were supposedly something that could change the understanding of human history and religion, and that is why the Allies chose to hide them from the public. Another version claims that some of the documents fell into the hands of private individuals and are stored in secret collections, from which hints and scraps of information sometimes emerge. Skeptics believe that the mystery of the disappeared archives can be explained simply. Many documents were destroyed during bombing raids or burned by the Nazis themselves to hide traces of their crimes. But this argument does not explain why some surviving materials are still closed to researchers, despite the passage of decades. Thus, the Nuremberg trials gave the world a picture of the horrors of Nazism, but left out one of its strangest and most frightening aspects: occult quests and mystical projects. The absence of these documents created a vacuum that was filled with myths and conspiracy theories. For some, this is proof that the Allies deliberately hid dangerous knowledge. For others, it is confirmation that there were no real results in these experiments, and therefore the archives were of no value. Today, the mystery of the missing Ahnenerbe documents remains open. Perhaps one day the archives of the Secret Services will open their funds, and we will learn what exactly was hidden behind the words "top secret." But for now, this story serves as a reminder. Even the largest trial of the 20th century, designed to shed light on all the crimes, left a shadow in which the darkest secrets of the Third Reich are still hidden. The influence of the esoteric societies Thule and Vril on the formation of Nazism. The history of the Third Reich is usually perceived as a political and military phenomenon, but its roots go much deeper, into the mystical and esoteric currents of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Among the many secret associations, a special place was occupied by the Thule Society and the lesser-known, but no less mysterious Vril Society. These organizations played an important role in forming the ideological foundation of the National Socialism, and their mythology and occult views had a direct influence on the symbolism, ideology, and cult atmosphere of the future Reich. The Thule Society was founded in Munich after World War I. Its founder, Rudolf von Sebottendorf, was fascinated by Eastern mystical teachings, astrology, and ideas of racial superiority. The name Thule came from the mythical northern island, which ancient authors considered the edge of the inhabited world. In the German esoteric tradition, Thule began to be perceived as the ancestral home of the Aryan race, a symbol of the lost paradise and a source of hidden powers. Members of the society believed that it was from Thule that the ancestors of the Germans came, possessing spiritual and physical superiority. The organization united people from different walks of life, from aristocrats and scientists to former military personnel. The meetings were accompanied by occult rituals, the study of runic magic, and the reading of esoteric texts. But at the same time, the Thule Society also had a political orientation. It actively participated in anti-communist and anti-Semitic activities in Bavaria, supported paramilitary groups, and even became one of the initiators of the creation of German Workers' Party, which later became the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was through the Thule Society that the first figures who played an important role in the development of Hitler's movement entered the political sphere, A lesser-known, but even more mystical association was called the Vril Society. Its name came from the novel by the English writer Bulwer Lytton, The Coming Race, which described a hidden civilization that possessed the energy of Vril, a universal force that allowed one to control nature and thought. German occultists perceived this novel not as fantasy, but as a hint of reality. For them, Vril became a symbol of hidden cosmic energy, which can be connected to through meditation, magical rituals, and contact with higher beings. In the 1920s, rumors began to form around the Vril Society. It was said that its members were female mediums who had the gift of receiving messages from ancient civilizations or even extraterrestrial beings. According to legends, they wrote down texts in incomprehensible languages describing technologies and knowledge supposedly lost by humanity. These messages were associated with Atlantis, Thule, or the inner world of the Earth. Some researchers believe that this is where the fantastic Nazi flying saucer projects and legends about secret bases originated. The Thule and Vril societies were linked not only by their shared esoteric atmosphere, but also by their members. Some researchers claim that future leaders of the National Socialist Party, including Rudolf Hess and Alfred Rosenberg, attended Thule meetings and were familiar with its ideas. It was here that the synthesis of racial theory, occultism, and political fanaticism was born, which later became the basis of the Reich's ideology. The symbols used by the societies were directly transferred to the Nazi arsenal. The swastika, for example, was used long before Hitler came to power, specifically in esoteric circles. For Thule, it was a symbol of solar energy, a rotating wheel, and Aryan power. When Hitler made it the main symbol of the party, he effectively gave a political dimension to a sign that already had a sacred meanings in mystical societies. No less important was the attitude of these societies to the idea of being chosen. Their members saw themselves as guardians of special knowledge that was inaccessible to the majority. This created an atmosphere of elitism that later passed into the structure of the SS. Himmler viewed the SS as an order, a closed community of warrior priests whose power was based not only on weapons, but also on a sacred mission. Here, the continuity between secret societies and the practices of the Nazi elite is clearly visible. After the war, many documents about Thule and Vril were destroyed or disappeared. This gave rise to endless rumors and conspiracy theories. Some claim that the societies were just a gathering of mystics whose ideas were convenient for political propaganda. Others are sure that it was there that plans were born to search for ancient artifacts, expeditions to Tibet and Antarctica, as well as projects to create new types of weapons based on Vril energy. Today, the influence of Thule and Vril on the formation of Nazism is assessed ambiguously. But the fact remains, the ideas of these societies helped create the mystical aura that surrounded the Reich. They gave ideology the appearance of antiquity and depth, turned politics into a cult, and symbols into magical signs. In this fusion of mysticism and fanaticism, one of the most dangerous aspects of the Third Reich was revealed: the belief that history is not controlled by people, but by secret forces to which only a select few have access. Thus, the Thule and Vril societies became not just an exotic episode in German occultism, but the real soil from which Nazism grew. Their mythology became a weapon, their symbols became symbols of power, and their ideas became a justification for cruelty. And this is what makes their influence one of the darkest and most mysterious chapters in the history of the Third Reich. Use of runic symbols in SS. Symbolism played a huge role in the Third Reich. For the Nazis, signs, emblems, and ornaments were not just decoration or a means of visual identification, but a tool for forming an ideology and creating a cult. Of particular importance among these symbols were runes, ancient Germanic signs that, in the view of Heinrich Himmler and the Ahnenerbe Society, possessed sacred power. It was the runes that became the basis of the internal symbolism of the SS and turned into the magical language of the order. Runes come from the ancient alphabets of northern peoples, and were originally used not only for writing, but also for magical practices. Each rune had not only a sound, but also a symbolic meaning. It was associated with gods, forces of nature, fate, and human qualities. In the 19th century, interest in runes was revived by romantics and occultists, who began to interpret them as a universal language of ancient wisdom. It was from this cultural context that the Nazis borrowed runic symbolism making it part of their ideological system. The most famous example was the two Sieg runes used in the SS emblem. These lightning bolts symbolized victory and power. In Himmler's eyes, they were not just stylized letters, but a magical sign linking the order to ancient sources of energy. SS members wore them on their collar tabs and rings, turning them into a sign of belonging to the chosen brotherhood. The double rune became a symbol of the elite, who perceived themselves as guardians of special knowledge and power. Another important rune was the Odal, depicted as a rhombus with tails. It symbolized heritage, lineage, and land. This was a key concept for Nazi ideology. SS officers were to see themselves as protectors of the Aryan heritage, linked to blood and soil. This rune was used in coats of arms, documents, and even architecture, emphasizing the idea of a people's connection to their ancestors. The rune Thur, depicting an arrow pointing upwards, symbolized strength, war, and the desire for victory. It was often used on banners and memorials. In the eyes of Himmler and his entourage, it was a symbol of a warrior ready to sacrifice himself for a great cause. The Hagel rune had an even more mystical meaning. It was a sign of fate and cosmic order. In some SS rites, it was used as a symbol of the integrity of the order and mystical unity. It was believed that this rune embodied the hidden order of the universe, to which every SS member should aspire. The rune Yer also occupied a special place, signifying harvest and eternal renewal. It was used in the marriage ceremonies of SS officers to symbolize the continuation of the family line and the strengthening of the nation. Thus, runic signs were included in the stages of a person's life, turning his personal events into part of the mythological project of the Reich. Runes were most widely used in SS cult objects. Each officer received a ring known as the Death's Head Ring. It was decorated with a skull and crossbones, but also contained runic symbols. Himmler presented these rings personally, turning them into a sign of mystical connection with the order. After the owner's death, the ring had to be returned to Wewelsburg Castle, where it was kept as part of the sacred heritage. Thus, runic symbols became an integral part of the cult of ancestors and eternal memory. Runes were also used in architecture. On the walls of Wewelsburg Castle, in the ritual and assembly halls, one could see runic signs embedded in the interior design. This was meant to remind officers that they were in a sacred space connected to an ancient power. Even the ornaments on furniture and weapons sometimes included runic motifs, turning everyday objects into magical artifacts. All these symbols played an important role in the formation of the special atmosphere of the SS. The runes gave the officers the feeling that they belonged to an ancient order whose roots went back to the mythical past. This feeling of being chosen and having a sacred mission strengthened their loyalty and discipline. Ultimately, the runic symbolism became not just a decorative element, but an instrument of psychological influence and ideological control. After the war, SS runes were banned, and their use in public spaces became a criminal offense in Germany. However, interest in them has not disappeared. On the contrary, in neo-pagan and neo-Nazi circles, they continue to be used as symbols of hidden power. In the modern context, this only enhances their sinister aura, turning them into signs burdened with history and mysticism. The use of runic symbols in the SS thus shows how deeply the Nazis integrated mythology into real politics and military practice. For Himmler, runes were not just archaic signs, but a tool for creating a new religion for the Reich. They linked the past with the present, turning SS officers into priests and warriors at the same time. And that is why runic symbolism remains one of the darkest legacies of the Third Reich, where magic and fanaticism merged into a single cult. Legends of Nazi UFOs. One of the most persistent and mystical legends associated with Nazi Germany remains the story that, in the last years of World War II, the Reich allegedly developed secret flying machines that resembled modern flying saucers. These stories combine real facts about technical experiments with military aviation and fantastic elements that give them an aura of mystery. For some, this is nothing more than a conspiracy theory. For others, a hint of reality hidden in inaccessible archives. The legend is based on Germany's desire for technological superiority. The Nazi elite understood that the war would be won not only by the number of soldiers, but also by the quality of weapons. That is why the Reich actively developed rocket and aviation projects, such as the famous ballistic missile and jet fighter. These developments showed that German engineers were capable of creating weapons models that were ahead of their time. Against the backdrop of such achievements, the idea of flying saucers did not seem so incredible. The most common Nazi UFO legends mention projects called WW2 and Vril. According to the stories, secret SS laboratories were working on creating disc-shaped devices capable of vertical takeoff, hovering in the air, and reaching incredible speeds. The inspiration for these machines was allegedly the texts of the Vril Society, an esoteric group that claimed that humanity could tap into the cosmic energy of Vril. German engineers, according to these versions, tried to implement this idea in a real technical project. According to conspiracy theories, the first prototypes were built in the early 1940s and were tested at secret bases in the Czech Republic and Poland. The devices were discs several dozen meters in diameter, with a cabin in the center and a system of rotating turbines. Some testimonies claimed that such devices were allegedly observed by eyewitnesses. They described strange objects hovering in the sky and moving in trajectories that were not typical of ordinary aircraft. The story of the WW2 project, a disc that could supposedly reach speeds of several thousand kilometers per hour and rise to heights of over 20 kilometers, became particularly famous. These characteristics seemed incredible for their time, but that was precisely the appeal of the legend. If the Reich had succeeded in creating such a weapon, it could have changed the outcome of the war. After Germany's defeat, rumors of Nazi flying saucers only intensified. They were linked to the disappearance of some German engineers who could have ended up in the United States or the USSR. As part of Operation Paperclip, the Americans actually took out hundreds of German specialists who worked on rocket and aviation technology. The Soviet Union also gained access to some of the developments. This gave grounds for versions that it was German technology that formed the basis of the first Soviet and American projects in space and aviation. Some researchers point to a coincidence. Mass reports of UFO sightings in the United States began in the late 1940s, shortly after the end of the war and the evacuation of German engineers. For supporters of the theory, this is direct evidence that the saucers were not of alien but Nazi origin. Antarctica occupies a special place in these stories. Legends about Base 211 and the fact that the Germans created a shelter for their discs there are combined with stories about the last stronghold of the Reich. According to these versions, some of the devices, along with engineers, were transported to New Swabia, where they continued testing after Germany's capitulation. In the late 1940s, Admiral Byrd's Operation High Jump allegedly encountered flying discs that attacked the American fleet, forcing it to retreat. Of course, official history denies such versions. Documents about real German aviation projects indicate that at the end of the war, unusual vertical takeoff aircraft and new jet schemes were being developed, but no evidence of the existence of saucers has been found. However, the very fact that Germany was conducting research in the field of advanced technologies allows many to believe that some of the projects could have remained secret. Legends of Nazi UFOs gained particular popularity in the post-war decades. They became part of pop culture. They were mentioned in books, films, and documentaries. These stories combined mysticism, science, and politics, creating an image of the Reich as a force that went beyond human capabilities. For some, this is a symbol of madness and fanaticism. For others, a hint of hidden knowledge that has not yet been revealed. Ultimately, the story of Nazi flying saucers straddles the line between myth and reality. Perhaps the Nazis did attempt to build disc-shaped craft, inspired by both scientific and mystical ideas. Perhaps it was all just a post-war invention, fueled by rumors and fears. But the very fact that the legend has lived on and evolved for more than 70 years shows its power. It has become an integral part of the mythology of the Third Reich, a mythology in which science, magic, and fanaticism are intertwined in a frightening and fascinating pattern. Occult interpretations of World War II as a magical battle. The Second World War is usually considered the largest military conflict of the 20th century, in which armies, ideologies, and economies clashed. But there is another view, which goes into the realm of mysticism. For some researchers, esotericists, and writers, this war was not just a struggle of states, but a real, magical battle, in which not only armies but also spiritual forces fought. This approach may seem like a metaphor at first glance, but in reality, it has its basis in the real obsession of the Third Reich leaders with the occult and the desire to give the war a sacred meaning. For the Nazi elite, the war was not only a geopolitical event, but also part of a cosmic drama. Heinrich Himmler saw the SS as an order fighting to restore the ancient order lost with the destruction of Atlantis. He was convinced that the war would allow Germany to reclaim its role as a chosen people, connected to ancestral forces and secret sources of energy. Wewelsburg Castle, where the SS rituals took place, was to become the symbolic center of this battle, a temple where spiritual power fed the war machine. The idea of war as a magical act was also reflected in the use of symbols. Runes, swastikas, black suns, all of these were perceived as instruments of influence not only on people's consciousness, but also on the energies of the universe. In the eyes of the Reich esotericists, every victory and defeat had not only a military, but also a mystical dimension, and the war itself was seen as part of the struggle between light and darkness, where each sign had a sacred meaning. On the other hand, the Allies also turned to mystical images, although to a lesser extent. It is known that during the war, British intelligence used Nostradamus' predictions in psychological propaganda, and Winston Churchill did not hide his interest in astrology. In the esoteric environment, interpretations appeared that Hitler was a black magician whose power was based on a connection with dark energies, and that only spiritual confrontation could destroy his power. Some occultists claimed that the war was the culmination of an ancient conflict between the orders. In their interpretation, the Third Reich represented forces that descended from the dark cults of antiquity, while the Allies were the heirs of the traditions of light, albeit unconsciously. This idea turned the war into a global ritual, where tank battles and bombing raids were only external manifestations of an invisible struggle on the subtle plane. Particular attention was paid to the figure of Hitler himself. His charisma and ability to influence the masses were perceived as a manifestation of magical power. Contemporaries noted that his speeches had a hypnotic effect, and the crowds responded to them as if they were in a trance. For esotericists, this was proof that he had the ability to control the collective consciousness, using it as a weapon. Some even claimed that he was under the influence of dark entities that directed his actions. Subsequently, the concept of the War of the Magicians emerged, which claimed that the Allies had their own esoteric circles operating on their side, opposing the occult power of the Reich. These ideas were reflected in post-war literature, where the war was described as a clash between black and white magicians. Such interpretations were popular in esoteric societies of the mid-20th century, which perceived World War II not only as a historical event, but also as a cosmic frontier that determined the fate of humanity. Even Hitler's death was given a mystical tinge in these interpretations. His defeat was linked not only to Germany's military collapse, but also to the loss of the sacred power that had supposedly left him in his final days. Legends that the Allies had seized the Reich's mystical artifacts only reinforced this perception, turning the end of the war into the completion of a ritual of exile. Today, the concept of World War II as a magical battle remains controversial. For historians, it is more of a metaphor, emphasizing the irrationality and mystical nature of Nazi ideology. But for esotericists and researchers of secrets, this version looks convincing. Too many facts indicate that the Nazi elite perceived the war as a sacred mission, and its symbols and rituals gave it the character of a global cult. Thus, occult interpretations of World War II show that it was not only a struggle of armies and economies, but also a clash of worldviews, where politics intertwined with mysticism. For millions of people, the war was a catastrophe. But in the eyes of those who believed in secret forces, it looked like a decisive battle between darkness and light, in which the fate of all mankind was being decided. And perhaps it is precisely this feeling that makes it one of the most mysterious and mystically charged wars in history. The mystical side of the Third Reich shows that World War II was not only a battle of armies and ideologies, but also a field for strange searches, occult rituals, and faith in ancient myths. Germany's leaders sought to give their actions an aura of sacredness, invoking the legends of Atlantis, the Grail, and Shambhala. These ideas did not make the Reich stronger, but they underscore how dangerous the union of politics and mysticism can be. Even after decades, archives and myths continue to hold their secrets, reminding the world that behind the rational war, there was another, dark and symbolic one,